Let's come to the 34th presentation in this series of a year. We're doing a strategic laving each week, each 7 days, so that there is the sense of a grouping by resonance. And when you have a grouping by resonance, all of what would seem in a linearity as repetition becomes a kaleidoscopic expansion that is available for a harmonic analysis. In mathematics, if one can do a harmonic analysis within a theory of groups, you begin to have a penetration below what was to the mind previously a unity that could not be broken down any smaller. The atom became subatomic in the late 1920s, early 1930s, largely because of an advance in mathematics. In 1928, Hermann Weyl published his theory of groups, and it moved the entire understanding of logic and mathematics into what has, in retrospect, been called the quantum world. The ability to look below unities is not to fracture unities, but to fraction, to be able to go into sub-unity proportionalities so that one can begin to have ratios which together then in groups, in sets, set theory being the precursor to group theory, set theory coming from Bertrand Russell, group theory from Hermann Weyl, and the development in its application through such geniuses collected around Niels Bohr as Erwin Schrödinger and Heisenberg, Wolfgang Pauli, Paul Dirac, etc. This group in Copenhagen was the group that developed the entire quantum world, where a complementarity of subatomic symmetry was the most penetrating, and now by the early 21st century, almost a century later, we understand that there is a unlimited sourcing of the limited computational capacities. The discovery of the confirmation by experiment of a theory that posited the Higgs boson, which was characterized as condensed vacuum, has a direct bearing on the mathematical computation for theory and further experiments to understand that we can go into a fertile vacuum which gives an emergence to particality and to energy in wavelet frequencies, and that they together have a symmetry. And that this symmetricality can have what the mind thinks as an infraction of the rule by a breaking of symmetry. And this infraction in the mind of the idea of a broken symmetry is at the core of mystical misunderstanding in civilization. The simplest example of this is for the mind to conceive of a patterning like yin-yang as a symmetrical complementarity, and that this would be then the ultimate sourcing, the oneness of that pair. And when this was first presented in Chinese thought by Tzu-Yen about 350 BC, the yin-yang chia in Chinese is school. The misunderstanding that came out of this spawned two great geniuses in Chinese thought. One was Mencius, who brought back a refinement of Confucius. The other was Chuang-Tzu, who brought into play a refinement of Lao Tzu. Both of them understanding that more primordial, more sourcing than yin-yang is Tao-Te for the Taoist, for Lao Tzu and Chuang-Tzu, and that the sourcing of Zhen-Yi, the heart comportment with the symbolic structure of thought of Confucius. Confucius not only wrote the Analects, which is the Zhen, the heart wisdom, but also wrote the commentaries, the 10 wings, as it were, to the I Ching, which is the understanding of the symbols. The symbols and the mythic heartfulness have a pairedness that pairs with the ritual emergence of existence and the Tao, which is the zero field nature, so that the entire pair of pairs can be characterized as a frame of reference, better as a square of attention, as I've been using for the last several generations, of nature, ritual, myth, symbol, and that this square of attention has the ability to go infinitely within, which is in a continuity with the infinitely without of the square of attention, of the frame of reference. The integral mind can only work with the geometry of the frames of reference, whereas the developments of quantum mechanical mathematics, as in Hermann Weyl's theory of groups that we began with, as with the developments of Schrödinger and Heisenberg and Wolfgang Pauli, not to mention Bohr himself or Paul Dirac, all of this led to an understanding that one can go deeper than unity and one can expand scalars into infinity beyond that integral as well. All of this was a heritage that now is able to be recognized in a kind of a new past, leading us to a very, very bright future, because we understand now, can understand, that all of this was the central wisdom that was passed on in ancient Alexandria, and that wisdom in ancient Alexandria goes back to an emergence as a carrier wave of civilization about 2,000 years ago. One of the great problems of the modern world, problem areas, aside from the difficulties of East and West, of China and America, of India and Europe, aside from that, one of the great problems in the world is to be able to understand Islam. And it is what we are looking at now to make an expansion of the time forms of civilization to include Islam. It is important for us in the early 21st century to be able to have the ability to expand out of the square of attention, out of the frames of reference, so that we exceed referentiality and we are able to dissolve the limitations of attention to an attentive field. And that attentive field is well known in terms of the great realizations that have happened with our kind over many thousands, sometimes even tens of thousands of years. To rediscover is to go back and bring that new past back into play in such a way that there is a recalibration of civilization, that all of the snags and hooks, hesitations, errors, gaps, missing, corrupted, skewed, all of this recalibrates itself as one brings that new past into play in terms of the true expansion of the presence, not the present moment, not time that is cut by a now into a then and into a coming. This is the essential assassination of reality in terms of an individualization of time as a now of an individual who wants it now, whose planning is a planning of redoing what has been in terms of what they intend their plan to be of what will come. And all of this is on a nightmare level when there are crises in the time forms of civilization. There are minor storms, there are major storms, and then there are hurricanes, there are typhoons. We live in the grand mother of all typhoons in civilization currently. Nothing false is going to stand, is not standing, hasn't for some long while now. And rather than face a bleak wasteland ending, it's better to have a realization that recalibrates and brings every promise into play. When Islam spread in that first generation from Muhammad, it was the most dynamic, powerful vision on earth at the time. And within that first generation, the spread of Islam was akin to, and note this, the tremendous success of the Islamic State, ISIS, in Syria, Iraq, just a month or so ago, of not only sweeping in a conquest, but sweeping because those who were supposed to be arrayed surrendered. gave over their equipment, their money, stepped aside. And it was like the parting of the Red Sea for Moses. It is a powerful vision that splits the tenacity of the structures that the mind, in its hubris, in its false pride, has thought that this was in play when something else was in play that stole the energy and ignored the fences, the borders, the mores, and just swept through. Islam did that. And finally, in 642 AD, reached Alexandria and swept into Alexandria and took over all of Egypt, which lay down for the conquering entree into the old world city that was laying fallow, but in that fallowness was still the residue, the remnant of its great apex of wisdom, some almost 6.5 centuries before. The genius that was there some 4 centuries before influenced almost immediately the development of a wisdom realization in Islam, first in 642, because they found that the structure of European thought was misplaced, that the early medieval world of the Western world was based on an incredible pastiche that had been pasted together by a false glue that would become brittle in time, and indeed by that time was indeed brittle. And the realization for the Islamic conquering generals and wise men advising them in Alexandria realized that a false scholastic form of Aristotle had been co-opted by a corrupt structure of the Church of Christianity, and that this had over time molded for about 300 years a false world, and that it was a house of cards, and that it could be walked through, and which they, by and large, did. In the next couple of centuries, Islam spread from Portugal to India, to Indonesia. They walked through like shards because they knew the way to see through, to carry their theoria, their contemplation, in between all of the so-called structures, and to use their ability to have a consciousness that was differential, to be able to literally ignore the glue in between these shards. And so it not only fell apart, it almost, one could say, it evaporated. There was a 2-step that followed that immediate realization that they, in Alexandria, 642 AD, had come upon the key of what had made the greatness of the West in the first place, and had been corrupted and a false realm pastiched together. The second move came in the grandchild generation about 70 years later in Jerusalem. Jerusalem by that time, for many, many centuries, had been not only destroyed and laid waste, but the only way that one could live in that area was in the mountains surrounding. And in those mountains, a young Islamic prince named Yazid, we recognize the name as the root source of a people called the Yazidis, who were just rescued by the tens of thousands because the current corrupt Islam, the Islamic State, was seeking to kill the Yazidis because they were not of the same jihadi, corrupted Islam which they are imitating, the original push of the Islamic vision. And so a very interesting translation of a manuscript published by Brandeis University and the University Press of New England in Hanover, New Hampshire, published in 1982. The Revelations, the title is A Testimony of Alchemy, being the revelations of Morianus, ancient adept and hermit of Jerusalem, to Khalid ibn Yazid ibn Muawiyah, king of the Arabs, of the divine secrets of the magisterium and accomplishments of the alchemical art. And this changed the great vision of Islam into a realization that they were not just penetrating through a corrupt structure of the West, but that they were engendering the original creative imagination that had made the West tremendously great, and that they indeed were then the inheritors of what had been set aside as being irrelevant was actually exactly what was now important. And what was the core realization at the time was that the whole genius in Alexandria was pinpointed on Hellenistic Judaism, on the merging of the Greek language in an Egyptian setting of a refinement of several thousand years of a Jewish tradition leading back. At the time, the emphasis was on Abraham. And the realization was that Abraham had, before he had the son Isaac, that the patriarchy of Judaism is passed through, his previous son was Ishmael. And that Ishmael was born of Hagar, who was an Egyptian, who the Islamic invaders saw as one of them. Now that they had the home front, the home city of the way in which all of this played out, and the realization came in waves that there was a whole group, there was a whole set of sons of Abraham other than Isaac, akin to Ishmael, because Abraham had children by several women. He had a child, two children actually, Joseph and Benjamin, by Sarah. And then there were children that came into play. Hagar's son Ishmael, but he had a third woman. Her name was Ketubah, and Ketubah had 6 sons by him. The daughters were not kept track of. And those 6 sons were the sons who populated the whole landscape into which Ishmael was sent in exile. So that there were 7 sons that grew up to be the population of people that now was the vision of Islam. And that foremost among those 7 sons, one of the sons had descendants from the time of Abraham who produced the wife of Moses. And that the wife of Moses then was of this Arabic lineage, of this Abrahamic Arab lineage, which was not the single writing hubris of a patriarchy of Judaism, but was the broader, huge family of the other 7 sons of Abraham. And so one had in the Islamic original vision a tremendous sweeping realization that the falsification of the sons of Abraham was at the core of what was wrong with the Judaism and was assumed to be the basis upon which Christianity had been a reformation. And that now Islam was come as a fresh vision to clean house, to take out the infidels, because a later prophet from Moses, Muhammad, had brought a new vision. Now, in the time forms of civilization we've been looking at, it's germane to introduce the fact that the reference wave that was very powerful in between the 2 aeons, Abraham and then 0 BC, 1 AD with Jesus. Jesus in Alexandria, to be specific. Jesus in Alexandria and Mary Magdalene, to be very subatomically specific. In between those 2, there was a reference wave. And the reference wave always precedes the carrier waves by about 350 years. So that if you go at the middle of 2000 BC and then 0 BC and go to 1000 BC, which is David and Solomon, but go back 300 years to 1350 BC, you come to Moses. And if you go then the 2,000-year Aeonic period, which was de rigueur of Alexandrian wisdom in Hellenistic Judaism, and Jesus, and Mary Magdalene, you come to 650 AD. So that from Moses to Muhammad is the reference wave of civilization. And what Moses delivered in the Torah and backed up in the Torah, not just from Genesis in the beginnings of Exodus, but the other 3 books of the Torah that come into play, especially Leviticus, and then Numbers, and finally added later and pieced together Deuteronomy, but especially Leviticus, which is the law of God applied to his people. The way it is spelled out, meted out in great detail. I'll bring next week the Anchor Bible edition of Leviticus, which is huge. It's very thick. So that Torah of Moses was replaced by the Sharia of Muhammad. And for those people who had just taken over Alexandria, and were expanding across northern Africa. They would take it over in the matter of the next generation and reach all the way across the Straits of Gibraltar into Spain. And reach across Spain and Portugal into France. And were only stopped by a relentless, self-sacrificing courage. A French general nicknamed the Hammer, Charles Martel, stopped them in France. And that was the first time that they had been stopped. This left a very interesting kind of a realm. One of the realizations was that if Alexandria was such a brilliant place, there must then be a hidden understanding in Judaism which would have been tapped at the time of Jesus. And if one could look at the subatomic structure of the vision of Jesus, one could be able then to see that something here, mysterious though it is to us currently, has to do with not only prophecy, which is like the prophecy of Moses and then the prophet Muhammad, but the carrying of that, the carrier wave of that reference wave, the carrying of that had to do with a secret refinement of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. And what came out took about 250 years to refine. And when it was refined in the Baghdad of Harun al-Rashid. Yes, our Baghdad. The leader of ISIS, of the Islamic State, styles himself as al-Baghdadi because of this. When we come back from the break, we will see that the refinement of this in Baghdad, in the time of Harun al-Rashid, was the Ikhwan al-Safra, the brethren of the purity, the true purity. Let's take a little break and we'll come back. Let's come back attentively. We're looking at the energy of civilization. The energy of civilization is time. In the universe, time is the energy of the universe. But for the cosmos, the source of time is the source of the cosmos. And the source of time is a zero field fertilized by an infinite field. Their complementarity has an entanglement known as love. Now, this is not only an ancient wisdom, it was a wisdom understood by beings similar to us who matured, and star systems that were mature before our whole star system was emerged some 4.5 billion years ago. It's not a question of just being ancient, but of primordial. We have now the maturity of civilization within our scalar of wisdom to be able to understand. We need to know what we are doing is almost completely irrelevant to reality. And so we're making excursions into sets of resonance that are amenable to a harmonic analysis. And that harmonic analysis is akin to an expressed appreciation of music. But just as there is a musicology, or there is an understanding of the compositional structuring of music, music itself is what is real. And so our harmonic analysis is not simply to point out the structure of time forms of civilization as a complex time energy. In the universe, time is a single dimension. It's the first dimension. But in civilization, the maturation of time has become triplex, triple, three kinds of time, three facets of time, which show up in the classical beginning of time forms, where the displacement of a natural cycle of universal time is shifted into a new quality of civilization, not with the emergence of cities. Proto-cities were there long before. In refined, intermixed cultures, there were already urban areas. One can look in the news, ancient Erbil was there some 7,000 years ago. Even origins longer. Jericho was there almost 10,000 years ago in origins. The metronome of time forms of civilization is language in its written expression. Writing a language connotates reading a language, meaning that one is able to think beyond the structure of symbolic thought in an integral mode. How is that possible? By not identifying, by not using identification as the metronome of what you are able to write and read. And the first written languages that were, as the saying is in language, in linguistics, the first written languages that were discursive enough to be read, not simply signs that were arranged, but were symbolic in the sense that they were read, was about 4350 BC, about 6,300 plus years ago. That marks a reference wave for the energies of time to now commence to have something which is tripartite beyond the time of the integral universe. Now there were excursions, largely by dreams, sometimes by seizures of moment, sometimes by the genius of vision before then. But one does not find a written language until that era. And so that is a reference wave. And that reference wave is a reference wave not in a time looking forward to a future, but because that continuum of wherein that reference wave occurs includes, which is a weak word, the reference wave occurs as a time energy in a continuum that goes back to the sourcing out of which time itself emerged in the first place in the universe. Consciousness occurs in an infinite field. It doesn't have a time limitation, but is differential. Gives the fertility to an integral acceptance, a receptivity that understands that with a love, that complementarity is fertile, and that the zeroness is not a zeroness, but is a scalar of receptivity without limit, able to embrace the infinite differential. And so one has a sourcing of a written language that can be read, so that the maturation proceeds in increments of what has been set up as a reference wave, expecting a carrier wave, because it's a reference of that carrier wave. But as one looks at the way in which the physics actually operates, it's not only a carrier wave of energy with a reference wave, but it has an enduring third quality of time. In music, it's the undertones to the tone, and then the overtone resonances that make the harmonic, that make the music, make the lyric. And the overtone, the third kind of time, was not able to be characterized until there was the ability to have a quantum mathematics that was refined enough to be able to understand that all of this coming together was not just integrating, but was like an implosive explosion of not a fission like the atomic bomb, which that was, or even the fusion of the hydrogen bomb, which that was, but an explosiveness that the creativity with a capital C now has come into play. And as it comes into play, as we were talking about it, 1927-28. At the time, there were conferences held every several years. They were called the Solway Conferences of Physics. Belgium, a rich industrialist, was sponsoring them. And at the Solway Conference, number 5, 1927, a who's who, Einstein, etc. Everyone was there. Dirac, the whole gang was there, including a French prince, Prince de Broglie. And he's the one who connotated, in a paper presented then, the pilot wave, the reference waves, the carrier waves, and the pilot wave. And that the pilot wave in mathematics is known as a soliton. That the soliton carries its energy without diminishing. It does not diminish. It does not have an atrophying. That soliton, pilot wave person, occurs without limitation, without degradation, without impairment. When we look at the high Dharma, we look at the Mahayana refined into the Vajrayana, and at that time, about 400 years after the beginnings of the Vajrayana through the Tantras, through the love complementarity raised to an infinite harmonic, the development of the incarnation, the history and mysticism of the Tulku tradition of Tibet. We talked last week's presentation, about how consciousness is stronger than matter, stronger than the integral structures of just the thought that a symbolic structure, a plan, an understanding would make. Way beyond that and way deeper than that is this quality of someone, like last presentation showed a photo by Joseph Needham of Hui Nig, the seventh patriarch of Zen Buddhism, in the middle of the 600s, at the same time that Islam took over Alexandria and Egypt in China, because Islam and China are heavily linked together, like Islam and Southern Europe are linked together, especially the Spanish, especially the Southern Spanish in Andalusia, where the genius of the Sufis was raised to a pinnacle that went off the charts with Ibn Arabi. At the very same time that the pinnacle of Jewish understanding, the Jewish tradition, also in the same places at the same time went off the charts with Maimonides. And because the echo was also into France, it went off the charts at the very same time in France that you began to have the realization that there's more to this than we've been told. The pilot waves of Louis de Broglie are persons who are able to understand the time forms of civilization, though they have not been called that previous to the developments that are being presented here. They were understood in various ways, in various languages. For instance, one finds in Ovid's Metamorphoses the 4 ages of man as the 4 metals: gold, silver, copper, and then iron. But if you look closely at Ovid, the Metamorphoses only begins with that because he's in the Roman Empire writing under Augustus Caesar, and he patiently morphs the Metamorphoses so that the 15th last chapter of the Metamorphoses is all about Pythagoras. He gets down to it. And when it was realized by Augustus what he had done, that he had sneaked in something that not only sabotages the Roman Empire, his principiate, his imperium, but that if he drew attention to Ovid by having him killed, it would make everyone wonder, why was he deserving of being killed? He exiled him to Constantia on the Black Sea in what is today Romania, where no one could speak Latin at all. Ultimate exile. Imperial powers, world orders, always fear losing their energy. They are not afraid of any kind of battles, any kind of engagement whatsoever. They fear what any kind of artificial power source fears, that someone will pull the plug. And it's not until later that they realize that someone already pulled the plug. Not only pulled the plug, but supply. Nothing is going to work anymore until a new source of mature understanding of the triple time energies of civilization has become the common knowledge, property, workability of the population on the planet. It can take as long as it needs. It can take as short as it needs. They're not conditions that are laid down. It's actuality that's in play. From here on out into infinity is a continuity. Here's how the Yazidis' origin in Yazid, Khalil ibn Yazid. In the name of the Lord, holy and compassionate, this is the story of how Khalid ibn Yazid ibn Muawiyah came into possession of the spiritual riches handed down from Stephanos of Alexandria to Morianos, the aged recluse, as is written in the book of Ghalib, bondsman of Yazid ibn Muawiyah. Now Ghalib was Yazid's faithful servant, entrusted with all his master's possessions, and in time, it is said, became faithful servant likewise to Yazid's son Khalid. And the first translation of this into English was 1982. Published in Hanover, New Hampshire. Lee Stavingen, almost unread. Equally almost unread is this volume by Ian Richard Netton, Muslim Neoplatonists, an introduction to the thought of the Brethren of Purity, the Ikhwan al-Safra. And they were constellated in the Baghdad of Harun al-Rashid, originally in the late 800s, and by the time one gets to the Ikhwan, the Brethren, there was a great maturity that had happened and came into play. Here's how the blurb reads from the cover of the book. The Brethren of Purity, Ikhwan al-Safa, were a group of Arab thinkers who lived in Basra, South Iraq, in the 10th or 11th century AD, the 900s, 1000s. They are as well known in the Arab world as Newton, Hegel, or Marx in the West. They are called themselves the sleepers in the cave of our father Adam. Notice now that they've gone back, not only back to the original Muhammad and that first generation of Islam, going back to Abraham, we are the inheritors of the other 7 sons of Abraham. Not only Ishmael from Hagar, but the 6 sons of Ketubah as well. We're the inheritor of the 7 sons of Abraham. That single self-satisfied patriarchy is a patriarchy of 1/8, where in the 7/8. But notice that the 7 now not only refers to Abraham, but refers back to Adam. Why? Okay, there's Adam, and then Eve is made out of a rib. Fine. They have 2 sons. One of them kills the other son. Cain goes off into exile. He has descendants. He married somebody outside, a woman outside of that lineage. They have a 3rd son, Seth, one of the great Gnostic Valentinians and then Sethians, that group that came out in the early 2nd century. Seth has to have a wife. She came from the outside too. The outside are all these women who are part of a huge general population, not just this little male patriarchy, but that the female receptivity and inheritance, like the mitochondria DNA, comes from outside of that tradition, so that they call themselves the Ikhwan al-Safa. They're known as the Brethren of Purity, as an ascription to them. They call themselves the sleepers in the cave of our father Adam. We go all the way back to Adam, a description which originates in the Quran. And in the Quran, in that surah, number 33, the legend of the 7 sleepers of Ephesus. Why is that so? Because the 7 sleepers of Ephesus in a cave, when Ephesus was a grand city with a great harbor and everything, and had several hundreds of thousands of people, was ancient, was also the place to where, after the crucifixion resurrection, Mary Magdalene moved herself, not back to Alexandria, didn't stay, never actually lived. When she was a little girl, maybe she lived in Magdala on the Sea of Galilee. After her father became a leper, Simon the leper, he was put in the Valley of the Lepers on the other side of the Mount of Olives. And the family built a new villa there in Bethany, so that they were within walking distance of the Father and so forth. It was a cemetery also. That's where Mary Magdalene's older brother Lazarus was put into a tomb and raised from the dead as well. And she was sent to the family business, which was in Tyre on the Mediterranean, which is the ancient colonizing city of the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians colonized Carthage in 800 BC. They colonized what became Marseille in 600 BC. And they went through the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar, and went down African coast as far as the Cameroons and up the Atlantic coast of Portugal, Spain. all of this was done so that by 300 BC they were already one of the great mariners from Marseille of Tyrrhenian impetus and descent, was the first to circumnavigate the British Isles, Ireland, and all the way out past the Faroes to Iceland, to where the sun never set. It was daylight 24 hours a day, 300 some BC. So Lazarus inherited the father's shipping business, trading business, and he took the young sister Mary Magdalene. The older sister Martha was overseeing the house in Bethany, and the mother, and visiting the leper father. And Mary Magdalene was raised under the aegis and protection of her brother Lazarus. And the shipping business went not only from Tyre across the Mediterranean and all the way to Britain. Eventually, Joseph of Arimathea would get to West Britain by the same shipping company. That shipping company had taken Mary Magdalene to Alexandria, now took her to Ephesus. And when she passed away in 57 AD, she was entombed in the cave of the seven sleepers, what would become the cave of the seven sleepers. That tomb is still there. And the first person to identify that that was the tomb of Mary Magdalene was a French savant who was raised a Roman Catholic, who had a tremendous psychophysical illness, and when he recovered from that, he had a lifelong interest in the mysticism of Islam. Though he stayed as a Roman Catholic, a French Roman Catholic, he was one of the first French great understanders of the Sufi mysticism of Islam. And he's the one, when he was in Ephesus, when he was in the cave of the seven sleepers, when he recognized that that surah in the Quran is almost ignored, as Mary Magdalene is ignored in the Christian tradition. He identified the tomb of Mary Magdalene. He was the first to do so. And I've included photos of her tomb. And his name was Louis Massignon. And Louis Massignon was the teacher of Henri Corbin. Henri Corbin lived from 1903 to 1978, and who is the author of all of the great works that began to open up Ibn Arabi and the mysticism of Islam. His two really great books, one is called The Man of Light in Iranian Sufism, and another is called Creative Imagination in the Sufism of Ibn Arabi, published in the Bollingen series, which had previously published another one of Henri Corbin's studies of Islamic wise men, Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, and his book, Avicenna and the Visionary Recital, in the Bollingen series. And Avicenna was from Central Asia, not Iran proper. He was from the same area that the ancient Zarathustra was from, around Samarkand. And Ibn Arabi was from Andalusia, from Murcia, very close to Cordoba, Seville in Andalusia. And so Corbin stretched from Zarathustran origins in Central Asia all the way to the furthest reach of Islam in Spain, and saw that this was a scalar of immense reach and refined depth. And so presented the fact that we have misunderstood completely. And if one looks at Ibn Arabi, looks at Andalusia, it is also the home of Moses Maimonides originally, born about 30 years before Ibn Arabi, born in 1135. And he was able, Maimonides was able to take himself out of the increasing encroachment of vicious attacks and criticism by Christians in Spain, who were getting rid of the Muslims, and now we're going to get rid of the Jews as well, and moved his people to a place of safety, to Egypt, where he was welcomed by the same Sultan who welcomed St. Francis of Assisi and saw that this was a wise man and provided Muslim shipping to take St. Francis back to Italy, welcomed Maimonides from Spain and made a place of honor for him there. All of this is contemporaneous with the development of Heloise and Abelard at the convent of the Paraclete in France, near Troyes, where in 1165, when Ibn Arabi was born, Chrétien de Troyes, the Christian of Troyes, first published his Arthurian 5-person visionary epic. Next week, in the presentation, we will take a look at how Ibn Arabi, Maimonides, Abelard, and Heloise, all of this has to do with the way in which Mary Magdalene, not only the companion, not the wife, the companion in a cosmos complementarity, was fertile by visionary direction. The last assignment from the cross is not, Father, why have thou forsaken me, but saying to her, behold your son, and saying to the young man, John, who's about 12 years old, behold your mother. The spiritual adoption by Mary Magdalene of young John, who became St. John. And she took him to Ephesus. He's the one that had her entombed in the cave of the 7 sleepers in 57 AD, and standing alongside of him when this happened was Apollos of Alexandria, the inheritor of the community of Philo of Jesus in Alexandria. And all of this was understood by Muslim mysticism and Sufism and completely ignored by the West to this day. More next week.